spent the day or so after Christmas just watching survivalist porn, which I'm wondering if it's a fantasy genre. So I kind of want to talk about that. All right. So we are live on YouTube. So let us get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming in to today's Popular Culture Dialogue. This is a little bit of a series that we're doing on the current state of. So we're looking at the current state of fantasy today. And with us, we have several well-renowned folks, people who have been here before, including a newcomer. And hopefully he's able to get his mic to work, because I definitely want to hear his thoughts coming from his cultural perspective. But today we're talking about fantasy, the entire fantasy genre, the current state of fantasy in popular culture. Here's Adrian again. I'll let him in. And what we'll do, as we usually do, is I will let our panelists first introduce themselves and maybe what brings them here today. So we will start off with Princess. Princess, you are a repeat visitor. What brings you here today to talk about fantasy?
Well, fantasy is my favorite genre of all the genres. And I read fantasy, I watch fantasy, I write fantasy. So I love fantasy. And then sometimes in all of the fantasy shows, religion is always part of it. So
I was just going to bring that up, given your focus on religious studies in the past. That will be interesting to bring into this conversation. So thank you for being here, Princess. And we'll go down to Christine.
I'm Christine Tomlinson. I am a lecturer at the University of California, Irvine, and I am also a postdoctoral scholar with the University of Southern Denmark. I'm here today because I like fantasy as a genre as well, and I also study it mostly in terms of video games. That's where most of my work is, but I also consume it outside of video games. Right now I'm wearing a Bard shirt based on D&D, so I feel prepared for the conversation. Happy to be here.
That is a great point to bring up in terms of the games, because the current status of Dungeons and Dragons, I think, is very fascinating. But also the recent game awards, the video game awards, and the outcry when Zelda Tears of the Kingdom didn't win, I think is also fascinating to think about. So thank you for bringing in those perspectives today, Christine. And then we're going to go to a newcomer to the panel. And Adrian, what brings you here today?
Hi, thank you for having me. I think my mic is now all powered up, I believe.
Oh,
yep. I'm actually currently I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Granada in Spain. I'm working as of now in the language of fantasy, so I'm very much interested in what either you see on the page or you see on, not see on screen, but you hear on screen. And yeah, I'm moving from TV to literature, but also I'm a huge fan of video games. So I've always got my critical eye there. So I'm just happy to be here. Thank you.
Wonderful. And that kind of relates to the recent special issue we just had for the Popular Culture Studies Journal on conlangs. And yeah, conlangs seem to be very important when it comes to the world building of any type of fantasy. So diving more into that, I think, would be great to add to this conversation. But where I want to start, and this is because I come more from a science fiction background, which sometimes I think is fantasy. So I kind of want to get at that understanding. But as I was just mentioning at the start of this, I spent, I guess, Boxing Day watching survivalist porn, aka disaster movies. And I'm wondering how much those would count as fantasy in some way too. So I just kind of want to get a start with how you all define fantasy. What is fantasy to you? Would ever like to start?
fantasy to me, it's about world building where the worlds are filled with gods or fairies or mystical creatures. And sometimes fantasy can overlap with science fiction or horror.
Mhm.
And that if you look at vampires, TV shows and movies, they can be categorized as horror or fantasy because vampires are a mythical creature, but then it crosses over to horror. So there is an overlap between fantasy and sci-fi and horror.
And I find that fascinating because I just watched The Last Voyage of the Demeter last night, which of course is based on the Dracula novel, but they bring in science and it almost sounds like at points that they're trying to use bacterial or viral infection to explain vampirism. So it's that interesting combination of the genres there.
I'm watching this show called Manifest. I didn't watch it when it was on NBC, but it is kind of fantasy, but then it's kind of supernatural, because it's mythological, religion, and all that kind of thing. Because I don't know if anybody has watched it, but Manifest, people disappear on a plane for 5 years and come back.
Oh, okay.
So it's a mixture of, it takes place in the present day time, but these people have been on the plane for 2 hours when they land in New York, the rest of the world thought they were dead for 5 years.
Okay.
So it's fantasy overlaps with sci-fi and horror.
Okay. Well, Christine or Adrian, what are your thoughts on what defines fantasy?
If I may, you see, one of the things that I have to question myself about when I'm thinking about fantasy, what I want to write about, is that there must be some elements that I would think would not be possible to see if I just go out of my apartment and into the street. Like there has to be something, I don't want to use the word impossible, but some kind of detachment from what I would expect on a daily basis, to be happening outside. I don't know, you call it people shooting fireballs, coming back from the dead, you name it, really. But it's true what Princess just said about fantasy merging, overlapping, verging on with different genres, which makes it very difficult sometimes because you may find also works of fantasy that begin as fantasy, then they may transition into science fiction or even science fantasy. But then that explanation, maybe that scientific explanation that it's given to you, it's refuted somehow. And then you're back in square number one in fantasy, and you don't really know what to do with that. So that's why maybe my approach to the genre was very much linguistic, in that I am trying to leave out themes. I am trying to leave out. I mean, you cannot completely detach it or separate them. But if you look at linguistically, there has to be some kind of extra dimension that probably you want to look up that builds up that kind of impossible element. Destiny I've seen as something that is featured lots of times, prophecies and this kind of stuff. So and at the basis of it, you have always this kind of struggle, either with yourself, with your identity, as with vampires, werewolves, fairies, witches, or a struggle between some kind of good and evil dichotomy, typical, opposition of elements. But at the core of it, there's always something impossible. Like I said, I just call it shooting fireballs so that everyone's in the clear and everyone knows what I'm talking about.
Okay, I like that, the idea of the impossible, not calling it magic or that idea, but something impossible given our current understanding of physics and how our reality works, basically. Okay. Christine, what do you think?
I was going to go with something very similar to Adrian's answer. effectively being able to see or do something that you wouldn't typically be able to do in your everyday life. Which also I think speaks, as Adrian said, a little bit to Princess's answer, where when you use that definition, suddenly so many things become fantasy, but we like to have these really stringent definitions of what genre is and try to box them in, which I don't know is always helpful. Because I do agree, like things like vampires or things like being in space, they're stuff that we wouldn't be able to typically do or see in our everyday lives. It makes it fantasy. But I think a lot of just the setting is what ends up separating fantasy from some of these other genres. Like if it's something impossible in space, suddenly it's science fiction. If it's something impossible in the context of monsters and it's supposed to scare you rather than fascinate you, suddenly it's horror. And I think that the line is very thin there. I think you could have a fantasy story that is based on vampires or is based on werewolves or something. If it's a little bit further removed from that, it's to cause you stress and fear element. So a few setting and or goal of what the media is supposed to do for the viewer.
Which makes me think like Twilight kind of walks that line, in that Twilight actually might be more fantasy than horror then, because the goal is not to scare you with those vampires and werewolves. The goal is apparently to get you horny, from what I understand of Twilight. So it is a fascinating idea then to think about. We've got these elements, impossible, mythological, supernatural. There's things that are happening that don't happen in our everyday lives, our world. And then there's, the goal of it is, and I like that idea of it's to get you to fantasize, almost to get you to be fascinated and to dream and things like that, rather than to scare and maybe that's also a tricky one though too, because to inspire, I think about how much like the Star Trek, the original series, inspired a lot of people to go into science and try to make what they saw in the series real. So that's a little bit different than just getting you to dream and to fantasize about things. So, okay, if we take all of this, all of these ideas in mind, what do you see right now as some of the most popular fantasy texts? Like what seems to be right now captivating and getting that fascination going in the audiences? Where is the fantasy these days?
I see a return to fairies, which have been out of, trend for some time now, at least at the commercial level, like being commercially successful. But I can see a return to the fairies as in an origin in fantasy for fairies, and also a huge boom of romance in fantasy novels. Like romance has always or often been an element in fantasy, but now it's becoming very much one of the prominent factors in fantasy for people to actually be drawn towards it.
And that's interesting because romance tends to be associated more with a female audience too. So Adrian, are you seeing this romance being a focus more on women again, or is it more of a queer focus as well? I mean, how is the romance being positioned?
I wouldn't necessarily describe it as as female focused. A romance, at the end of the day, you can experience it as from many perspectives as you want. So you don't have to be always female to be enjoying romance in a book. I think it's also a consequence of canonical masculinity breaking down or accepting other facets, and not just being as rigid as maybe we want to categorize genre. So masculinity or masculine genre is already dissolving as well, and you can see that that's becoming one of the elements that's drawing people, whether it's female, whether it's queer, whether it's you name it. But I think that romance has been, on the rise for quite some time now as an element that is attracting people towards fantasy. Maybe you just want to see this kind of impossible relationship as idealizing your own vision of love. I don't know. I haven't given it much thought. Let me ponder on it for a while now.
These dialogues tend to be good for getting those ponderings going. Princess, what are you seeing happening out there in fantasy world?
So I see fantasy now where is at. There's the blur lines in the different blur lines. I see fantasy these days blurring with horror or science fiction, especially on with the TV shows and Netflix TV shows and things that are popular out there right now. Like you have Wednesday. It's not necessarily fantasy, but it's blurring the lines of fantasy and horror. And in the past, you had Lucifer. So so for right now, I see the genre is blurring the lines between what's fantasy, what's horror, what's supernatural. And I also agree with Adrian. Romance. There's a lot of romance in fantasy now. The focus, all of the fantasy is romantic right now, and it's not generally for women. Men seem to enjoy it, but I also do see a remerge of the epic fantasy with Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings. Yeah. So
the TV show. Isn't there?
Yeah.
Isn't there another Lord of the Rings movie coming too?
I think
is
so.
That fake? I saw. Yeah, well, more Lord of the Rings. Okay.
But I would like for fantasy in my for mermaids to come back, but I haven't seen a mermaid movie in a while, so hopefully that will come back.
Yeah, I'm not sure the Little Mermaid live adaptation did well enough, which is something I also want to talk about when it comes to fantasy. The animated versus live action is fascinating right now. And again, for Netflix doing it. Christine, what do you see going on right now in fantasy?
I'm going to take this as an opportunity to talk about Baldur's Gate 3. So that won Game of the Year. I think that it's also a really interesting overlap with some of the other things that Adrian and Princess said, because a lot of people refer to it as kind of a dating sim, because there is a lot of romance in it, and that is what a lot of video game players who played the game focused on and really latched onto, even though it's sort of a background element of the game. But I think the fact that that game pulled in such a huge audience and did manage to win a lot of awards from a lot of different outlets, not just kind of the game awards. It's really interesting to see D&D adapted in such a big way, especially since in teaching, I've had a few years of being able to see students have no idea what D&D even was, had never heard about it. And then you have things like Stranger Things that are suddenly bringing D&D back into the conversation. And now we have actively people getting so interested in D&D because they played this video game that was based on the system. I think that there's a lot of stuff going on right now that is making fantasy, and I don't know if it's in particular kind of high fantasy, something that people are drawn to and interested in. I don't really have the answer for why that is. Like, what exactly is pulling people in that direction, particularly since one of the last conversations that I had with you on horror was that people seem to be drawn to this despair in horror, which seems to be the opposite of what's going on with fantasy. People want these big stories, these hopeful, overcoming the odds kind of epics. So I think that that's a little bit interesting, but I do think that at least in the video game space, fantasy is doing pretty well, and people are clamoring a little bit for it just based on some of the reactions to newer releases.
I think it's actually talking about the why people are clamoring for it. I think it's, two sides of the same coin. You can despair about what you're seeing in the everyday real world when you step outside or turn on the news or social media. But then you could also seek, for that same reason, the hopefulness of the escapism of these worlds where you probably have, especially in games, a lot more agency to be able to make the world a better place. I mean, getting at that idea, Adrian, of destiny and fate and whatnot in fantasy, the idea of the chosen one, of the hero's journey and all of that. I mean, especially in games, every player becomes the hero that can save the world to an extent. And I think that can be a very powerful thing when the world around you seems to be crumbling very slowly into a worse and worse dystopia.
I haven't gotten around to it, but correct me if I'm wrong. I think that a Baldur's Gate also allows you to play the role of the evil. I mean, you craft your own story, don't you?
Yeah,
Because sorry, because I tend to gravitate towards the bad side of fantasy, so I tend to gravitate towards the villains. I find them more interesting. And the same happens for me when I play a video game. If I'm playing Tears of the Kingdom, I want to do evil things to the Cologs. When I am playing Baldur's Gate, I want my character to do evil things just to see what happens. It's this kind of curiosity. And not just the hero nowadays, but also something that can be a little bit dangerous. If people get carried away with it, is this sense of tasting evil, not actually carrying it out, but tasting it in yourself. So I think that's also something that that even verges on this horror theme and these dreadful and horrible status that we're seeing nowadays of the world and evil, especially. I don't know if I'm making any sense. I'm speaking as I think. So
No, I have a lot of students because I teach a game design class, and a lot of the students talk about how they like to play as the bad person, or we talked about the idea so many games are built for you to play the hero, but why not have games built to be the villain and things like that? And it is interesting to think that maybe there is more of that these days, especially in fantasy, where maybe you're not the villain, but you're the anti-hero or something like that. So you can get away with doing bad things that, maybe you do want to do in the real world to an extent.
I always root for the villains in the fantasy shows. Because the most times, for me personally, the heroes are boring. So, but the villains are usually complex in fantasy. They always have this story, whether it be a sad story or origin story. They're more complex than the heroes, in my opinion.
Yeah, I also think. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think it's a little bit interesting, and I haven't studied this. I don't have numbers on this, but it seems like in the last decade or so, that villain complexity has also, not that it never did this, but increasingly sort of used villains to address actual issues or kind of the villain is actually expressing something positive in a way, identifying problems in the world and trying to find solutions for them. And they seem like they're kind of a safe platform for attacking things that maybe you're not supposed to have heroes be against, things like capitalism, for example. So I think that that's really interesting too, is that you're not necessarily supposed to identify with or like villains, but they are this platform for complexity and something interesting, and increasingly messages about justice and improving the world, which is very strange if you think about it, because the hero is still kind of that blank slate, bland, doesn't really have a stance other than, this is what's supposed to be correct, and I have to fight the villain because that's the right thing to do.
And it's interesting when you look at superhero fantasies, because that's more what I study. And you go from Magneto, and I think when Magneto showed up in the first X-Men movie, as Holocaust survivor, that really got a lot of people to pay attention to the complexity of villains. And that then goes into Thanos, even current portrayals of Poison Ivy essentially as an anti-hero, an eco-terrorist anti-hero, I think is an interesting take on these things where, yeah, you have the villain is making some good points, maybe going about it in a way that's going to harm a lot of people, but still making some good points. I mean, Killmonger in the Black Panther movie, really good points. Perhaps not the right way to go about it, though.
Yeah, this brings to my memory now because I've been recently watching The Fall of the House of Usher.
Mm.
Don't want to spoil it for anyone, but at the one of the closing scenes, a character says that we humans, we are a virus. We are like a virus. We are destroying things. We are, evil. And you can see throughout the whole miniseries that, like in The Fall of the House of Usher, like in the original short story, they go down because of their own personal flaws, and they are given always a chance to redeem themselves, but they choose to keep being the way they are, and that's their actual, demise. But this particular character, which is not featured in any of the short stories, is the one calling attention to that. Like he explicitly puts it into words and saying, "Hey, this is happening to us because we did this to so many people." We may have been, not actively searching for it. We may have been wanting to do something that was better than what we actually did. But in the end, ultimately, this is what we have caused, and so we must pay for it somehow. And they all do in their own ways. And I think that's what's really interesting about villains. Like we see them struggling sometimes to make the right choice. Sometimes they may not be interested in doing or having this good motive, but we see them struggling because of their backstory, because of the origin story, because they can actually see what they are doing to people. And I see that complexity in that I still am a human, might not be. I am an entity, let's say, and I want to achieve my goals. But sometimes people are gonna get in my way, and fantasy is just a way of dramatizing that. Like you want to achieve something for yourself because you believe it's good, you believe it's what you want to do. Maybe the means are not the most appropriate ones.
Mm-hmm. Is there something about fantasy and about that ability to world build possibly a completely different type of place than what we experience? Is there something about fantasy that allows for this type of complex or more complex exploration of these issues? What do you think, Princess?
I'm not sure what is it about fantasy.
No, go ahead.
I'm not sure that what it is about. Sorry. Yes, I was saying that I'm not what it is about fantasy that gives room into complex stories. But I do think because fantasy happens around of the impossible or possible, people are drawn to the fact that these villains, these characters, the realm of possibilities and impossibilities, can be complex, can be diverse, can make good points about issues that you can't really say in the real world. And I think one fantasy show that does well, that did well, was Once Upon a Time. And I think
Mm.
that fantasy, it shows that the fact is that why villains are complex, we humans are complex, and that more often we make wrong decisions, we become evil or bad, not because we were born like that, but circumstances
Mm-hmm.
happen. So fantasy is because of possibilities and impossibilities, and because of the fact that because we're drawn to these worlds, we can see that for the most part, people are a product of environment.
Mm.
That's the thing about fantasy.
It's also kind of that idea of the magic circle too. It's that we see in game studies, that idea of you're entering that alternate realm where other things can happen that don't then impact the real world, but they can still come out of the magic circle because of your thoughts as the player. Christine, what do you think about this idea of fantasy being a place of possibility for exploring complexity?
I think it's sort of interesting because, and I'm gonna go back a little bit to our conversation on horror as well. I think
Mm.
horror does something very similar, and I think in a lot of ways, both horror and fantasy used to lean more toward the metaphorical and the more symbolic. So not directly tackling issues, but always being kind of about issues, global issues, personal issues, because stories are a way for us to explore our experiences, our identities.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing, and this is a half-formed thought because it hadn't occurred to me before, is that it seems like in both horror and fantasy, they're being a lot more direct about it. Like interrogating these issues and these experiences, not as metaphorical, not as symbolic, but as very much based in what we see happening in the physical world.
Mm-hmm.
Which is sort of a unique turn. And it's not that they never did that in the past, but I do think that there is a little bit more bringing fantasy into our physical world realities and sort of linking those things, which is easier if you're not in something like a high fantasy setting, because obviously if you're like in a fictionalized world in a medieval setting, there's not going to be a whole lot of room for dealing with physical world problems. A little bit more symbolically, perhaps a little bit more directly, but not in our reality the way you would see with something like Marvel.
Mm.
But I think it is one of those kind of safe places to explore these things, to interrogate these things, to think about them and consider them in ways that aren't necessarily going to completely weigh you down or depress you, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like the safety to interrogate, I guess.
So maybe that's where the survivalist porn I was watching doesn't fit with the fantasy, because it was very depressing. But it got me thinking again about this idea of looking at possibilities, because I watched a couple months ago, I watched The Day After, which is a 1980s TV movie about a nuclear attack on the United States and the aftermath of the attack. And just the other day, I watched one from the UK from about the same time, which is interesting, called Threads. And both of them are pretty graphic in terms of showing the nuclear attack and the aftermath. But I also wonder how much the presence of those in the 1980s helped to prevent the thing that they were presenting, because it's so graphic and it was so scary. I think it helped get people even more up in arms against nuclear proliferation. And now I'm seeing survivalist porn that's either, they've gotten kind of away from zombie apocalypse, and now it's either natural disasters or it is civil war of some type. And it's interesting then, because hopefully that's also this attempt to try to talk about the possibilities, try to make them seem impossible so that people will want them to be impossible, if that makes any sense. Because, yeah, I don't want to live through the stuff I just watched, because it was bad. Adrian, thoughts? There's something percolating. I can see that.
I think it also has something to do with the fact that perhaps in popular culture studies, fantasy, literature, you have to almost always substantiate what you do with a social, way. Otherwise, people may look down on you and see, hey, what you're doing is just, another fairy story, another story for kids. So you have to actually impregnate it with some social issue or problem that you may want to explore, and that maybe it's relevant to you and to your vision. But it's something that I sometimes see as a kind of an afterthought, that oh, this is something that we have to include so that we can actually substantiate our work, so that it's seen otherwise as being something more than just a story, more than just fantasy, so that we also interrogate these complex social issues. When Christine was speaking a minute ago, I thought of The Dark Crystal, which was revamped by Netflix a few years ago. You could see a lot of eco-criticism there, even though their natural world has nothing to do with ours. But you could see that symbolism and that analogy that you can translate back onto our world, and also the issue of identity is something that I've seen very much interrogated in these social under this social lens. You see how witches are a danger to themselves, a danger to the world, vampires as well. Vampires are nowadays not as evil as they used to be. Now we see them being, complex characters, but they always express their identity as something that is a danger, maybe to themselves, as something that they want to maybe hide from the world. And you can also trace that back as an analogy to queer people, trans people, or people who, are sadly in the lower steps of the social ladder, if you want to call it that way. And fantasy lends itself pretty well to doing that, to actually problematizing that issue and bringing it up again to the surface of conversations. That is, at the end of the day, in the shape of TV series that is consumed by millions of people that now are probably thinking about that as well, if they can see the analogy.
Yeah, and maybe not like doing a lot of in-depth thinking about it, but yeah, it might be somewhere in the back of their mind. It might come up at some point. I also think it's interesting, that idea of legitimizing through having the issues, because fantasy does have that long-standing stereotype, traditionally being for children. It's that idea that once you grow up, you put aside your games and fantasies and you deal with the real world. I mean, are we still seeing that in fantasy these days, or is it because of this focus maybe more on issues to legitimize that fantasy is being seen as something not just childish anymore? Have we changed on that? Like with D&D becoming so popular again, video games, the impact of the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Not just those works, but also animation has become more complex nowadays, and they deal with very much, adult topics now, so that they are maybe not digested but presented to children, and not only to children, because you can see how animation has become more and more adult-like in the recent decades. You have many examples to name, but if you go precisely to the mode of animation, which is traditionally for children, you can see how even that niche of the fantasy is becoming increasingly more complex and increasingly more adult-like. So I see an attempt to get away from these, association with children's literature, not as something bad, but as something that may want to, differentiate between the two of them, so that we stop, argument of fantasy for children or fantasy for adults.
It's not like the dark and gritty reboots or adaptations of the 80s and 90s. It's a little bit more nuanced and complex these days. Christine, Princess, any thoughts on this topic? Oh, I think you muted yourself, Princess.
I agree with Adrian. With animation, you can see that fantasy animation is becoming very complex. But at the same time, if you go into movies and TV series, a lot of the movies and the TV series are usually PG-13 and up. So I see that the producers, the writers are not trying to appeal to children, well, at least younger children anymore. They're appealing now to teenagers and adults. You know, because a lot of the fantasy shows I've seen, what I watch or seen are PG-13 or TV-14, and so it's clear that they're not appealing to the kids anymore. So yes, fantasy is changing the stereotype that you're not supposed to, that it's for kids. And even with the romance edition, like Twilight, it is moving away from the kids to teenagers and adults because you're adding romance into the picture.
Yeah.
So that's how fantasy is moving away from its stereotype.
Yeah, I think we haven't even talked about like Game of Thrones, which I know kind of burned itself quite a bit, but you know, that was a huge, I think, touchstone culturally for a lot of people, where it became this enormous thing that it seemed like everyone at least was aware of, if not actively consuming. And I do think that the setting for fantasy has changed in terms of consumption, in terms of who we assume the audience to be, and they have been taking more of these things that could be considered more niche, like the Game of Thrones books, and turning them into things that are much more readily and easily consumable and definitely focused on an adult audience, or at least like young adult and up, as Princess was pointing out. But it's also like you see it in stuff like the Witcher series, very popular, not necessarily for kids, kid-friendly-ish, but not aimed at children, aimed at a more adult audience. And also there's another interesting thing, as Adrian was pointing out, with the animations, kind of moving away from just children as well. Watching people play tabletop fantasy games is pretty niche still, but it is something that is gathering a lot more of an audience, gathering a lot more attention. And you have stuff like adaptations of The Legend of Vox Machina, which is a tabletop game that people are playing, has been created into an animated series that people are watching, with enough support to get multiple seasons, which is interesting. So I do think that fantasy, and also kind of playing video games, these things that used to be considered a little bit more escapist and a little bit more negative, like with that negative connotation of, oh, you're just trying to get away from your obligations, which is all you're supposed to focus on as an adult. I do think that we have started to shift away from that perception.
But I wonder how much at the same time this focus on adults is a way to capitalize on nostalgia as well. And like, so I'm particularly thinking about when we have the live action adaptations of animations that Disney has been doing, and Netflix has been doing, because we've got Avatar: The Last Airbender, which, you know, one of the best animated series to come out of the United States, is being adapted now into a live action. And it had been before, which was horrible, and no one should ever watch it. So hopefully this one gets it right. but it is kind of that idea of, are they seeking to go after kids who have never seen Avatar and will be interested in live action? Or are they really just doing this to go after the people who grew up with the animated series and then Korra as well, and giving them, you know, something because it's that nostalgic buzz? I mean, how much of this adult versions of the fantasies we're seeing out there now are just attempts to tap into nostalgia in some way? And that would be a form of escapism again.
I think that that's a really interesting point. I think it depends on what the media is. Like with stuff like adaptations of The Witcher, I think that that was trying to bring a story that was somewhat popular in books, pretty popular in video games, to a bigger audience. And obviously this is motivated by wanting to make money. But you know, you can't really fault them. That's how these things work. For stuff like the live adaptations of different like animated films that you might have watched as kids, I think that part of the goal there is nostalgia. It's also to kind of bring parents who might have their own kids in to be like, oh, we can share this thing together. This is something that I want us to be able to do together because I enjoyed it as a kid and now you can enjoy it as a kid in this brand new format that's exciting and shiny and interesting. So while it's all motivated by wanting to make money, because that's all anything is ever motivated by, I do think that the nostalgia angle is trying to capitalize on something a little bit different than some of these other adaptations are. At least that's my read on it.
Any thoughts on that issue, Princess?
I think most, yeah. Oh, yes, I agree with Christine. It's about money, but also a lot of the live adaptations is about nostalgia. I mean, especially Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast. I think there was a Cinderella live action. People my age or who grew up with Cinderella and have kids would want to share in that experience with their kids. So yeah, it is about nostalgia. Yeah, I think even The Lord of the Rings too is about nostalgia for people who read the books back then, who saw the movies in the 90s and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, and the continuance of the Harry Potter movies through I can't even remember what they are, the prequels. And I'm pretty sure if Warner Brothers or Paramount, if Paramount buys Warner Brothers, whatever that's going to become, if they want to keep that license, they're probably going to keep producing it as well. So it's, you know, nostalgia, but then it's still, you know, we want to keep the licensing rights. So we're going to keep producing fantasy films off of these texts because, yeah, we want to keep making money off of them as well. Adrian, anything you would like to add here?
I think nostalgia is a very dangerous thing. It's a two-edged sword because even though you're trying to, you know, use it as a bridge to get to money, you still are revamping or rebooting a product that many people might have loved, you know, 20, 30 years ago. And you have to live up to their standards. All people are going to hate it, and you know it's gonna come back at you and bite you in the ass. If you don't do it well, if you don't do it being very clever about the current context, the current media, the current formats, because you have to please now not only one generation but two of them if you want to attract newcomers, and if you want to keep the older ones engaged, you have to know play your cards very well. To please them both. So even though I agree with Christine, like everything else, this is just about the money. And anytime someone says that, you know, conversation settled, you just won the conversation. Money is the ultimate goal. Precisely, nostalgia is something that can backfire at you. You have to be very clever about it in how you're going to do it. Just take, for instance, the mermaid, the Little Mermaid fiasco, and even Sonic, was it? I think as well. He had even to be redesigned because people didn't like the prototype for the character. So there you have it. How nostalgia and iconic designs, iconic characters. You have to be very clever about them and what you're going to do with them.
Yeah, I don't know how many live action versions of animated classics or animated TV movies has actually been terribly successful. Like, at least I'm thinking in terms of the Netflix, because they've done now Cowboy Bebop, they've done One Piece, they've got Yu Yu Hakusho coming out, and Avatar, but none of them seem to have really been big hits compared to bringing over Korean fantasy or bringing up, completely new animations or something like the Arcane series that they did. So sometimes, yeah, the nostalgia can work, but sometimes it really can't. And I think we also just watched Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny last night, which has fantasy elements to it, like I think all Indiana Jones movies do, because it brings in the mythological and the religious and things like that. And this time it was Greek history and mythology and whatnot, but it was still trying to make it sciencey. And yet the attempts to be very nostalgic and have those nostalgic Easter eggs just really fell flat, especially with the de-aging that they did for Indiana Jones. It just did not work. And it was better than Crystal Skull, because that movie is horrible. But yeah, it seems to be a practice that the businesses want to do a lot of, but I'm not sure it's as successful as they would hope it is. Which maybe brings me to my last big question. Where do you see right now a good example of fantasy world building? Oh, sorry. Anything to add to what I have just been saying, Princess, or?
No, I was just making a joke. I was saying, at least with Indiana Jones, they got one thing right: an 80-year-old professor who refuses to retire.
And the fact that he was living in a very small apartment, I'm like, yep, that's what a professor can afford. So hey, that makes total sense to me. But if we look around at fantasy text these days, where do you see good world building happening? Like, where do you see possibly the next big fantasy text that people will be nostalgic for when they get older and have kids themselves? Like, where's that world building happening, in your opinion? Because I'm not sure.
I still think that the world building is happening with the classics. Like Cinderella, Little Mermaid. I think that they're going to, that world building is going to continue making live action films, all of these classics and so.
I'm struggling.
It's Aladdin or Hercules. I was saying that I think there's a Hercules or Aladdin live action. So.
True. Adrian?
I was saying that I'm struggling to find my answer to that question. Like, where do I see good fantasy or good fantasy in terms of world building? Precisely what we've been saying. I find now when I'm thinking of examples, like popular examples, all I can think of are adaptations or revampings or rebootings, and it's getting tiring for me. Like, I want new material. I love these texts. I may love them, but I want to visit new ones. I don't want to revisit these anymore. So when I think of good fantasy, I've been recently very much into a anime rabbit hole, and I see anime being or enjoying the freedom that I would like, the Western industry to enjoy as well. Like, they do crazy things, they explore things, they may be success, some of them, they may be failures, but I see them being, bold about what they're doing. So that's one good example. And I've been really, really hooked on the Wheel of Time TV adaptation. I think that's something that, in my eyes at least, to my taste, that's what I can say, it's being very well done, with a lot of care, and characters, are being adapted to the 21st century in a very good fashion. Like, we don't see these kind of women complexity that that was depicted in the books, which actually there was very little or none, and now we see these complex female characters being adapted. So in that sense, animation is the way for me to go, because I'm a little bit tired of these live actions or revampings or reboots of old text that are, like I said, but if I want to go back to them, I can do that. Give me new things to enjoy and to get me thinking about something else.
In a way, Vox Machina, I think the animated series has been doing that for me. And you read the graphic novels that are related to it, and that, even though it builds off of D&D essentially, it's still going off in a different direction that I think is rather useful to create something new. Christine, do you see any good world building happening anywhere?
So I guess I'll speak a little bit to video games, and then I'm gonna be a bummer, probably. So there are video games that are fantasy that I absolutely love. Like Dragon Age is one of my favorite series ever. And obviously it's also connected to graphic novels and books. There's a lot of stuff going on with that. And a lot of people, I think, do and have loved that series. And I think we see something similar again with Baldur's Gate 3, where people are latching onto it. They're interested. It's using a prior text, but it's doing interesting and creative things with it. Dragon Age is continuing. There are a lot of worries about that I'm not going to get into, but we'll see how the next game in the series does. But I think talking about long-lasting text or long-lasting examples of fantasy world building is difficult now. And we had this conversation in a prior discussion about how fragmented pop culture is now, how difficult it is to get people kind of into the same things or knowledgeable about the same things. And I think because it is so fragmented, I think partly that might be why we see so many revampings and so much kind of latching on to nostalgia, is to get those prior audiences in. But I also think, too, it's going to make it very difficult for us to see long-lasting, long-standing kind of like IPs, if you want to call them that, in the way that we used to, because people are consuming very differently. People are exposed to things in very different ways than they used to be. So I think we're going to see great stories, but I don't necessarily know that we're going to see stories that have the same kind of lasting power.
That's interesting, because I was also thinking about going back to maybe the Star Wars mythos and Star Wars world building, because that's always been my main one. And how I think it's Dave Filoni, if I remember his name correctly, his essential takeover of Star Wars and the world building he's been doing within that mythos from Clone Wars on up, like the Night Sisters and everything, going up to the Ahsoka series recently. That seems to be another approach that's going on, where you take a pre-existing world where maybe part of that fantasy in the mythos has been constructed, but then this whole big part hasn't been. So with his focusing away from the Skywalker saga, he's really fleshing out a lot more of the universe and the galaxy and things, like more than one galaxy now. So I think that's also another interesting way to approach this, which still gives you the nostalgic IP kick that businesses want, but can give you a deeper world building, essentially playing in someone else's sandbox, to use that metaphor. Maybe that's another way that we see this happening in fantasy these days, like Lord of the Rings being expanded the way that it has been, trying to pick up every little thing that has been written and exploding it into a bigger world that way. Well, I think that might be where we want to end. I would love to get just maybe one last recommendation from each of you. What's a popular culture fantasy text that you recommend scholars look into? Something maybe that you've been watching or playing or reading or even just listening to if there's a podcast. I think of like Night Vale and those types of fantasy podcasts. What would you maybe recommend other popular culture studies scholars take a look at? Because I know I would recommend Hilda on Netflix. There's a lot to mine, I think, in that series. And it is an adaptation of a book, but again, I think it expands upon that adaptation for world building.
My recommendation would be Bloodborne. I'm knocking on Sony's door, but they won't let me in. If they would, I would have done something with it already. But it's difficult to. Maybe Christine can share something with me if you know how to get data from video games, like language text, because I think it's copyright, very complicated, and I've been knocking on Sony's door, but they just won't answer. So my recommendation would be on that route, Bloodborne, horror, fantasy, Lovecraftian things. So very interesting.
Christine or Princess or Christine?
I'm gonna keep on the Baldur's Gate 3 train because I think that there is a lot to work with it. And also just like fan and audience and player studies, how people receive these stories, how they interpret them, how they expand them. Like I'm interested in things like fan works, for example. It's very interesting to see, and I don't want to do spoilers either because it's still relatively new. It's only been out for a few months. But it's interesting to see how people connect to and interpret and kind of take on specific characters and their stories and infighting among fans in terms of how you consume those stories and how you interpret them and what's correct and what's not correct. And I think that that reveals some really interesting things and interesting dynamics in both individual and group processes of engaging with a fantasy format or a fantasy story.
Very good. And Princess, anything that you'd recommend that we look into?
Well, I haven't had much time to watch television or anything like that. But so my recommendations are a bit dated for now. So I will recommend Manifest. It's on Netflix now. It takes part, without giving too much spoilers, it takes place in our present time, but it has a lot of religious and mythological stuff going on. It's really good show without being too preachy, kind of, oh, God is causing all this, or blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So, and currently I'm reading a book called The Mermaid on Black Conch, and it's by Monique Rufia. She's a Trinidadian author, and so it's about a mermaid. It's about a mermaid from the indigenous people of the Caribbean. So not give too much. It's really good so far. I'm still reading it.
Yeah. And maybe Princess, if you have access to Netflix at some time, I recommend you watch the South Korean fantasy drama horror series Hellbound, because it also has this idea of a religious connotation that is really fascinatingly done. And there's at least one season. There is a second season coming, which I need it soon because it was one of those binge-worthy series. So, all right. Thank you, everyone, for coming in today, this weekend of the end of 2023. And here's hoping 2024 is better for a lot of the world, because I think we could use it, and then maybe we won't have to escape into a fantasy quite as much. But Happy New Year to you all. And yeah, hopefully your 2024 goes well, and I'll see you all next year.